Digital sovereignty is becoming an economic imperative for a number of reasons. It's certainly trust is a prerequisite that underpins every digital transaction, especially those digital transactions that matter the most, that have the most financial value to them. Digital trust is also, digital sovereignty is also becoming an economic imperative because it has the potential to unlock significant GDP value, significant value within our economies. McKinsey study of a number of years back states anywhere between 3% and 13% of GDP can be unlocked by 2030. That said, that value that's being projected of unlocking really only materializes when digital credentials and verification can work across borders, and when it can work in the public sector and in the private sector. So certainly, these are some key reasons that digital sovereignty is an economic imperative. Finally, I would say that the times that we're living in, from a perspective of geopolitical movements and changes in global economies and trade, certainly are driving more focus and more priority on ensuring that we have sovereignty in all aspects as regions around the world, as countries, and particularly in digital as well. So both, I would say, in terms of the forces that are unlocked through the capabilities, through the global digital economy, and as well through the balance of the geopolitical changes in trade and what we've been used to is certainly evolving over the last number of years. In terms of models for regulation, the Canadian approach certainly does differ from that of the European Union. We would say that the superpower of the European ecosystem is the ability to mandate. And in the context of the work that we do for digital trust, identity verification, and these capabilities, the EIDAS and the EUDI approach as mandated certainly are a driver for the European ecosystem. In the Canadian ecosystem, we don't have the same governance architectures, and potentially also not necessarily the same culture in going forward with a mandate approach. We have, in terms of identity for people and for organizations, there is a distributed architecture for governance, and it's not we don't have the same arrangement where the federal government can necessarily mandate our provinces to put in certain architectures. This is not constitutionally defined within our ecosystem. So that said, we do have areas in our economy, in our ecosystem that are federally mandated, like our national defense, our finance, our financial scheme. These are federally mandated. When it comes to legal instantiations of personal identity and even corporate identity, it is a distributed ecosystem. There is sovereignty within our provincial governments and authority within our provincial governments. So much of the approach that we need to take in the Canadian ecosystem is based on consensus frameworks, multi-stakeholder governance, and in some cases even voluntary participation that's market-driven. From a global perspective, if we would put forward that the European Union and the European ecosystem and culture is much more of a regulated mandate approach, and the United States ecosystem is much more of a market-driven versus a mandated approach in the United States ecosystem, the Canadian ecosystem really kind of sits somewhere between those two approaches, one being very regulated, one being very market driven. We sit more in the middle, and because of this, the approach that we take is more certification based. It's got jurisdictional regulatory mandates within certain jurisdictions and professional societies. So we really do, we don't have the ability to have a tool as powerful as a full across Canada mandate in digital identity and digital trust. So therefore, we take a kind of a more of a middle ground approach, and something that is complementary to both the highly regulated spaces of the European Union and the highly market-driven spaces of the United States, for example. So it's much more of a middle ground approach that we take. Yeah, so if we have discussed areas around digital sovereignty, and we've discussed a more regulated approach, a mandated approach versus a market-driven approach. The strategy that we've put forward in the organization that I have the privilege and honor to lead, which is the DIACC, is something that we're calling a parallel tracks model. And what this means is that while our federal government is moving forward under the authority that it has for particular credentials, if you're thinking like our National Tax Authority or immigration records and things of that nature, where the federal government is the authority, in the Canadian ecosystem, where we have provincial governments that are authoritative over their space, we've actually seen a very strong forward momentum within our provincial developments. And so in the province like British Columbia, there's reported 4.6 million what we call our service card users. This is our credential that unlocks different services in the British Columbia ecosystem. Within the province of Quebec, they have recently in October of 2025 passed their own bill, their own legislation around the government's right to issue digital credentials and move forward in that space. So the work that we're doing, we say that it's a parallel track in the sense that we look at the provinces and the jurisdictions as labs of innovation who have the ability, who are closer to the citizens and residents perhaps than the federal government, have the ability to move within their, to make progress within their spaces underneath their authority, and leverage that labs of innovation in the jurisdiction to inform the directionality, the strategic approach from a nationally authoritative space for nationally authoritative credentials, which would also come into play in international trade as well. So we've got kind of two tracks there, one being jurisdictional for the provinces, one being federal for those areas which are federally authoritative. And then there's a third track, in fact, which is the track where our industry moves forward to solve the business problems that it needs to solve. We have found challenges over time in our ecosystem in trying to really bring all of these tracks into the same speed, into the same set of priorities. And what we found is that rather than to try to force each of these three distinct tracks into the same model, into the same exact strategy, we actually benefit from building in this parallel approach where each of these three tracks, provinces, federal, and industry, have the ability to inform each other and to fuel progress, and to motivate and to build bridges of interoperability across those three tracks where they are appropriate. So in this sense, we have the ability to enable those spaces to move, enable those jurisdictions to move quickly and industry to move quickly where it needs to, while informing the larger transformation that needs to happen in the federal space. So it's not a competitive tracks. They are in fact parallel and informing each other along the way in digital trust transformation. AI AI-driven threats absolutely have changed the need for urgency. In fact, where the Canadian ecosystem has been and continues to be largely focused on privacy and security. In fact, the third actor now in that space is the deep concern of the public that they do not have the ability to trust information that they're seeing, information that they're hearing. So there is a common concern over low trust in that space. We also know that from an AI perspective, it has provided tools for bad actors to do fraud at much higher rates and with much higher scale. And synthetic fraud, synthetic identity fraud, and deepfake fraud was reported as tripling from 2.8% to 8% of credit applications in the space of just 12 months. So AI-generated identity-related data and tools are really designed to exploit the gaps between interoperable and non-interoperable ecosystems and find those places where fraud can be done and can be done with much higher damage being done along the way. In terms of reviewing the space, we've seen stats as high as 30% of enterprises now don't trust traditional methods of identity verification alone. So we know that the AI has really driven the ability to do more fraud, to do it at less cost, and to do more damage using lower set of skills in the ecosystem. And that's a recipe for fraught with challenge for all types of people and organizations within the ecosystem. The positive side of that is that the tools for AI that the bad actors are using to drive fraud and synthetic identity and deepfakes and other areas, these tools are also available to provide analysis, to detect fraud, to detect signals and anomalies within systems. So we do have both sides of that space that are in front of us. The challenge that's the fraud that's being driven massively by the AI capabilities and all of the considerations around it, as well as our ability to put those same tools to use for us to detect that fraud and to fight it. So it is definitely a paradoxical ecosystem that we live in, but I would say no different than other spaces where the tools that are presented to us can be used for bad. They can also be used for good as well. So that's the challenge. Yeah, I would say that what other countries can learn from federated trust frameworks is the areas of looking at interoperability, looking at different drivers for adoption that are complementary to and yet different from mandates and regulation. Certainly, mandates and regulation are powerful tools. They really help to move a space forward. That said, and I've seen this in the European strategy as well, which I would commend, also looking at the different motivators, commercial drivers, recognizing that in a federated ecosystem, not all parts of that ecosystem will move forward at the same speed, and there will need to be an iterative approach on the way forward. So I think that just as a federated governance, federated trust framework based ecosystem has the benefit of watching and analyzing and learning what has worked well in a highly regulated environment and what capabilities have worked well, what adoption drivers have worked well in a highly market-driven environment. I would put forward that each of those spaces, the regulated and the market-driven, can stand to learn from the convening approach, from the building bridges of mutual recognition approach that we're taking in the Canadian space. So I would say as well, what the approach that we've taken in the federated trust framework space is that we've work to focus in on specific business problems that are causing pain points, and that are also have the ability to unlock opportunity. And I would put forward that the large scale pilots and the European ecosystem are doing something very, very, very similar. So in the cases where we're taking different approaches, we have the opportunity to learn from each other and what's worked and where have the challenges been. We also have the opportunity to learn from each other in the spaces where we're taking similar approaches around focusing in on business problems, which I commend the European ecosystem for doing through the large scale pilots. Yeah, I would say that what the audience can expect from my talk is to take away more context on the nuances between regulated ecosystems and market-driven ecosystems. And in fact, that the regulation-driven versus market-driven is the wrong angle to take the debate at. What they will take away is insights on building trust across different governance structures. What do those tools look like? How can we, what are the architectural constraints that we need to put in for building those bridges of trust for interoperability? And how can we work strategically? And given that we're working across different governance structures and different sets of drivers within our parallel tracks for adoption ecosystem in Canada, we think that we have opportunities to share lessons learned for some of the hard gaps to cross across international jurisdictions, thinking about digital trade, thinking about how do we take our trust from one ecosystem to another. I would say as well that the audience should take some insights into some of the hardest gaps on cross-border identity, which is around our governance, how our governance and culture intersects, which is actually not a technical issue, but more of a human space, human policies and processes that attach. And I think that they will also take away the audience will also take reinforcement of the urgency that AI is driving, and the urgency to act and to solve business problems with speed, given that we need to address the AI-driven fraud while the governance architectures and the bridges between ecosystems will continue to mature. So I think that there will be a number of lessons taken and opportunities for our Canadian ecosystem to continue to learn from what's happening in other jurisdictions around the world. Thank you.